I wanted to revisit the fourth Pan book of horror stories, which I only very recently reviewed, because although I gave a kind of potted summary of the book and the stories, I didn't talk more generally about the horror stories in the volume. They fall into two categories. One is psychological horror, and the other is supernatural horror. And that seems to be about a 50-50% split between the stories, with two stories spanning both forms of horror. And I'm particularly interested in this because I've found myself starting to write one or two horror stories myself, but I haven't thought about it consciously, about what makes up or is a horror story. And so I'm just going to go through the stories in the volume and describe what they are and why they are what they are. So on the psychological horror story side, Various Temptations is a psychological horror in the way that the mass murderer, the kind of Jack the Ripper character, interacts with the victim he falls in love with. And obviously there's a tension there because she knows he's a murderer and she knows he's a murderer. And so there's that lovely dynamic where you know it can't last. There's going to be a denouement, and it's the psychological threat of, you assume it's Jack the Ripper, but you never know. The next story up is The Pale Boy, and this is a much more straightforward psychological horror. You're given a hint of what the boy is capable of when he's first come across in the orphanage, and then when this woman takes pity on him and takes him into her house, his full psychological manifestation is revealed. I mean, he has a deep psychological issue which is very dangerous, and she doesn't discover it, but we as the reader can see what's happening, and so we know what the problem this boy has. Lucy Comes to Stay is just it's kind of schizophrenic dual personality story. Then Guy Fawkes Night is the story of a son who hates his father with a vengeance, and it's really the lengths that the son will go to get revenge on his father. Moonlight Sonata is, again, it's kind of madness and horror, murder. The Little Girl Eater is an example of horror using children, and that's kind of the horror, is that, you know, a child is involved. And The Little Girl Eater, the child is actually innocent in the story. It's the child's lack of understanding of the predicament of the person that she finds, and the way that the other adults who interact with the child disregard the child's story, and that adds the tension to the plot. Sardonicus is a story of a man kind of driven to insanity by a deformity that he has. He has a terrible misformation of his face, and of course you judge people by the way they look, and people find him horrifying or terrifying, and that influences his psyche and the way he subsequently behaves in the story. And that's a great study, and I suppose in a way kind of insanity. The importance of being earnest is a story about how you can misjudge other people and what you think their intentions are based on their vocation, who they are. If you go to a hospital, you expect the nurses to behave in a certain way. And as I said in the previous discussion of the book and this story, it's really a version of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know which came first, actually, whether this came first or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but they have strong parallels, and it's the behaviour of the nurses that catches the criminal out. Finally, the Ohio love sculpture, it's a bit of a gimmick, actually, because you have two collectors of erotic art discovering a new sculpture that is highly erotic and battling over getting ownership of it without realizing what it really is. And what it really is reflects the nature of the artist who made them. So it's kind of his psychological malformation. And so those are all the psychological stories. And then the supernatural stories, which are the other half of the book, are The Emissary, which is really a piece of magical realism by Ray Bradbury. And it's written beautifully poetically in the way that he does, but it's a bit of a stretch, the whole story. The dog acts as the emissary. It goes out into the world and then comes back to his young owner who's bedridden, and the young owner infers from the leaves caught in the dog's coat or various other behaviours of the dog about what's happening in the world. And also the dog brings back friends, and so that's all charming. And then the twist is that the dog likes digging, and then a friend dies, and you can probably work out the rest. And that involves kind of supernatural influences. The Two Old Women is just a straight voodoo story. I'm sure there's lots of horror involving voodoo. Harry is a kind of malignant spirit, malignant ghost story. Ringing the Changes is another supernatural horror where the pealing of bells causes the dead to rise from their graves. It's just straightforward supernatural. The Horsehair Trunk is interesting. I didn't quite describe it correctly in my previous summary of the work. The protagonist discovers that he can leave his body and first of all travel around the environment, and then secondly he learns how to manipulate objects in the environment while he's in this kind of out of body state like a ghost. And it's understanding that gets you to the twist, which is good in that case. It's clever. That's one of my favourite stories. The Attic Express is just a case where a father has a model train and then he becomes part of the model. And part of the joy of that story is his description of being part of the model. It's well done. It's clever. The writer is very observant. But the overall plot is it telegraphs what's coming at the end. And then there are two stories that are kind of crossovers. One is Slime, which it's kind of almost really science fiction. You have this, basically a kind of semi-sentient slime coming out of the ocean. And you could say that's, it's scientifically based, but it's the slime itself, its characteristics aren't very believable. And so it comes across as a hybrid between, a piece of science fiction and a piece of horror, I suppose, which made me think, what are the most horrific movies that I've ever watched? Or it's horrifying, I should say. And I would say one is Alien, which is straight up kind of psychological horror, science fiction horror. Brilliant. I love that movie. It's one of the best horror movies ever, as far as I'm concerned. And that's just a straight kind of psychological horror because you have this monster. And then another one is The Omen, which when I watched it, absolutely, didn't like it at all. And that's a kind of occult stroke supernatural horror. And it's like my two favourite stories in this volume. One is The Horsehair Trunk, where you have this man who can have this out-of-body experience and then manipulate things when he has this out-of-body experience. And then The Little Girl Eater, or you bring children into horror and then you place them in situations where either they behave as adults and they're horrifying because of it, or they can't be understood and they have a vital piece of information, and that brings the horror. And it's that latter case in this one. And so that is my higher level analysis of the stories. And I do wonder whether all horror stories fall into those two classes of kind of a psychological horror versus the supernatural horror.